Section 1. The show that burns everything it touches. There is something almost meditative about the long, strange history of Family Guy. If you sit with it quietly enough, if you let the stories breathe and unspool the way they actually happened, you start to realize that this show has left more wreckage in its wake than almost any other comedy in television history. Not just wreckage on screen, not just the fictional suffering of animated characters who can't speak for themselves, but real, actual, documented human wreckage. Careers ended, reputations shattered. People walked off sets and walked out of studios and walked away from paychecks that most of us would never see in a lifetime, all because of jokes. Animated jokes. Jokes delivered by cartoon characters in a fictional town in Rhode Island that does not exist. That is what tonight is about. Not the show's history in the broad sense. Not the ratings, not the Emmy nominations, not the cancellations, and revivals and streaming deals. Tonight is about the specific, granular, sometimes almost unbelievable moments when something that happened inside the Family Guy writing room, or on screen, or in a Twitter feed, or in a recording booth, crossed a line so visible and so clear that people on the other side of it lost their livelihoods, or threatened to, or made choices that changed everything. We are going to move slowly through this story. We are going to take our time. And if you happen to be lying down right now, if the lights are low and the world outside has gone quiet, and you just need something to listen to as your mind finds its way towards sleep, then this is exactly where you need to be. Because these stories are worth knowing, worth sitting with, and worth understanding. Family Guy is not just a cartoon. It has never been just a cartoon. It is a mirror held up to American culture. And sometimes, the people holding the mirror get burned by what they see. Let us start at the very beginning. Not with Seth MacFarlane's famous near-death experience on September 11th, 2001. Though we will get there, but with the question of what kind of show Family Guy was always trying to be, and what that aspiration cost everyone involved. When Seth MacFarlane pitched Family Guy to Fox in 1998, he was 24 years old. He had studied at the Rhode Island School of Design. He had worked at Hanna-Barbera on shows like Johnny Bravo and Dexter's Laboratory. He had made 2 short films about a man named Larry and his talking dog named Steve, characters who would eventually become Peter and Brian Griffin. And when he sat across from Fox executives Gary Newman and Dana Walden and showed them that hand-animated 7-minute pilot, something clicked. They ordered 13 episodes. The show premiered on January 31st, 1999, the night after Super Bowl 33, and pulled in around 22 million viewers. 22 million people watched that first episode. Let that settle for a moment. The show that now struggles to hold 700,000 viewers on a Wednesday night once attracted 22 million in a single evening. The distance between those two numbers tells you almost everything you need to know about what happened to Family Guy over the next 25 years. But the reasons for that distance are complicated, and they are human. And they involve decisions made by real people with real careers and real consequences. From the very beginning, Family Guy announced itself as a show that was not interested in politeness. Its humor was dark. Its references were obscure. Its cutaway gags moved at a speed that television had never quite seen before. A character would make a comment. The screen would cut to some absurd tangential scene. That scene would play out for a few seconds. And then the show would snap back to the main story as if nothing had happened. It was disorienting in the best possible way, and it became the show's signature. But it was also, from the very earliest episodes, a show that was circling certain kinds of danger. Jokes about religion, jokes about race, jokes about tragedy, jokes about things that most television writers in 1999 would have looked at and quietly, gently put back in the drawer. MacFarlane was not interested in the drawer. He was an atheist. He was politically liberal. He had a sense of humor that operated on the assumption that nothing was genuinely off-limits, as long as the joke was good enough, smart enough, subversive enough to justify its own existence. And for a while, in those first few seasons, that philosophy produced some of the sharpest animated comedy that had ever aired on American television. But here is the thing about a philosophy that says, nothing is off-limits. Eventually, you test every single limit. And sometimes, when you test the wrong one in the wrong way at the wrong moment, something breaks. Tonight, we are going to talk about those breaks. We are going to talk about the voice actor who walked out of an episode because a single line of dialogue crossed a line he could not cross. We are going to talk about the writer who posted a joke on social media in the immediate aftermath of one of the deadliest natural disasters in modern Japanese history and watched his career nearly collapse in real time. We are going to talk about the episode that Fox itself refused to air, the episode that was pulled from streaming after a national tragedy, the episode that sparked international diplomatic fallout, and the episodes that led to one of the most significant casting changes in the show's entire history. We are going to talk about real people, real consequences, real careers in the balance, and we are going to do it slowly, quietly, the way these stories deserve to be told. So get comfortable, let the room settle around you. We have got a long way to go. Drop a comment below and let me know the time and place you are watching from right now. I love knowing where in the world you are tuning in. And if you have not subscribed yet, please consider hitting that button. It keeps the channel alive and helps us make more content exactly like this. Section 2. The writer in the room, Alex Sulkin, and the tweet that nearly ended everything. March 11th, 2011. The world has just watched Japan endure one of the most catastrophic natural disasters in recorded human history. The 2011 Tohoku earthquake struck at 2:46 inches the afternoon local time, a magnitude 9.0 quake that sent a series of tsunami waves crashing into the northeastern coastline of Honshu Island. The waves, in some places reaching heights of over 40 meters, swept entire towns off the map. Power plants were damaged. Nuclear reactors went into meltdown. The death toll, when the full accounting was finally done, would exceed 15,000 people. Hundreds of thousands were displaced. The images being broadcast around the world were some of the most harrowing ever captured on camera. Entire communities simply erased by the force of moving water, people clinging to rooftops, cars floating down streets that had become rivers. In the United States, people were watching this unfold on television screens and computer monitors, with the kind of helpless, silent grief that comes from witnessing something that language cannot fully process. Relief organizations were mobilizing. Celebrities were tweeting messages of support, prayers, condolences, links to donation pages. And then, in the middle of all of that, Alex Sulkin posted his joke. Sulkin, for anyone who does not know the name, was at that point one of the senior writers and executive producers of Family Guy. He had joined the show in 2005 after the revival, worked his way up through the writing staff, and become one of the key creative voices on the program. He was by any measure a successful and established Hollywood television writer. He had co-written the Star Wars homage episode Blue Harvest, which was genuinely celebrated by fans and critics. He had a multi-year overall deal with 20th Century Fox Television. He was, by the standards of the television industry, exactly where a writer wanted to be. And on March 11th, 2011, the day after the Tohoku earthquake had begun to show its full, terrible scope, Alex Sulkin posted the following message on Twitter. If you want to feel better about this earthquake in Japan, Google Pearl Harbor death toll. Take a moment with that. Because the thing about that joke, and it is worth thinking about carefully, is that it is almost perfectly calibrated to be the worst possible thing you could say about a natural disaster. It is not just insensitive in the casual, thoughtless way that people sometimes are when they speak without thinking. It is insensitive in a structured, deliberate way. It takes the tens of thousands of people who were dying in real time, as tsunami waves rolled across the Japanese coastline, and reframes their deaths as a kind of karmic retribution for a military attack that happened in 1941, 7 decades earlier. It suggests that there is a moral ledger somewhere in the universe, and that the current inhabitants of Japan, who had nothing to do with Pearl Harbor, were in some cosmic sense getting what was coming to them. This was not a cutaway gag. This was not dialogue in an animated comedy. This was a real person, with a verified Twitter account, speaking in their own voice about a real event in which real people were dying in enormous numbers. The response was immediate and severe. Within hours, the tweet had been screenshotted and spread across the internet. News outlets picked it up. The same piece ran in multiple international publications. Entertainment journalists wrote about it. Fans were furious. Non-fans who had never watched a single episode of Family Guy were furious. People in Japan, and people with any connection to Japan, were furious. The tweet turned into exactly the kind of story that the entertainment press loves and fears in equal measure, the story of someone in a position of creative influence using their platform to say something genuinely reprehensible, and then watching the consequences arrive at speed. Solkin deleted the tweet the following day. At that point, the death toll had risen from the initial estimates. He posted an apology that read, in full, "Yesterday death toll equals 200. Today equals 10,000. I am sorry for my insensitive tweet. It's gone." The apology was noted. The conversation continued for a news cycle or two. And then, remarkably, Alex Sulkin kept his job. He was not fired. He was not disciplined in any publicly documented way. He continued as a writer and producer on Family Guy, eventually rising to become one of the show's head showrunners alongside Rich Appel, the man who posted a joke about dead Japanese earthquake victims using Pearl Harbor as the punchline, went on to run one of the most watched animated shows in America for years afterward. Now, there is a version of this story where that outcome is evidence of Hollywood's tolerance for bad behavior, of the way that creative industry ecosystems protect their own, of the specific kind of immunity that attaches itself to successful television writers working on profitable shows. And there is something to that version. It is not wrong exactly. But there is another version, a more complicated version, that acknowledges what actually happened in Sulkin's arc after that moment. In the years following the tweet, Sulkin became one of the advocates within the Family Guy writing room for pulling back on the show's more gratuitously offensive content. When the decision was made in 2019 to phase out gay jokes from Family Guy going forward, Sulkin was one of the executive producers who publicly confirmed and stood behind that decision. When the show began the slow, imperfect process of acknowledging that some of its older comedic habits were no longer working, he was part of that process. People change. Sometimes public humiliation is the mechanism. Sometimes watching your own words spread across the internet and watching thousands of people tell you that you are a bad person for saying them has an effect on how you write for the next decade. The Pearl Harbor tweet did not cost Alex Sulkin his job, but it is genuinely worth asking whether the career that followed it, the showrunner who led Family Guy into the era of reconsidering its worst habits, would have been the same person without it. What the tweet absolutely did cost was something harder to measure than a job. It cost credibility. It cost the specific kind of trust that comes from being seen as a thoughtful, humane person in your professional life. For a writer whose whole craft depends on the audience believing that there is some intelligence and intention behind even the most outrageous content, being publicly revealed as someone who finds historical mass casualties to be an appropriate comic framework for current natural disasters is a particular kind of reputational damage. It takes a long time to rebuild. Some people would say Sulkin never fully did. The tweet also became one of those crystallizing moments in the larger story of Family Guy's relationship with its own worst impulses. The show had always pushed against taste and decency. That was the point. But there had always been, in the early seasons especially, a sense that the pushing was purposeful, that there was a mind behind it, that even when Family Guy went somewhere uncomfortable, it was going there with some awareness of what it was doing and why. The Pearl Harbor tweet suggested something different. It suggested that at least some of the people making the show had internalized Family Guy's logic so completely that they were now applying it to the real world, treating real suffering as raw material for quick, dark jokes, without stopping to ask whether the joke was actually good, or smart, or worth the cost. That is a specific kind of damage, and it takes a specific kind of reckoning to address. Sulkin apologized, he continued. He eventually became one of the people responsible for steering the show in a different direction. Whether that arc represents growth or just survival is a question that probably depends on how you feel about Family Guy in the first place. But the tweet happened. The consequences, limited as they were in professional terms, happened, and the ripple effects in terms of how the show thought about itself and its humor extended much further than any single news cycle could capture. Section 3. Fox draws the line. The banned episode, and the network's nervous silence. There is something quietly remarkable about the episode of Family Guy that Fox refused to air. Not because the episode itself is particularly extreme by the show's standards. Not because the content is more shocking than anything else Family Guy has done across its 20-plus season run, but because of what the refusal reveals about the complicated, sometimes adversarial, always financially motivated relationship between Seth MacFarlane and the network that made him famous. The episode is called Partial Terms of Endearment. It was written by Danny Smith, directed by Joseph Lee, and was intended to be the season finale of Family Guy's 8th season in May of 2010. Its premise is fairly simple in the way that Family Guy premises usually are. Lois Griffin runs into an old college friend named Naomi at a reunion. Naomi and her husband Dale have been unable to conceive a child. Naomi asks Lois to serve as a surrogate mother. After considerable back and forth with Peter, who is characteristically and catastrophically wrong about almost every aspect of the situation, Lois agrees and undergoes in vitro fertilization. And then Naomi and Dale are killed in a car accident. What follows is an episode in which Lois and Peter have to decide what to do with the pregnancy. Do they carry it to term? Do they give the baby up for adoption? Do they have an abortion? Peter, after stumbling into the orbit of anti-abortion activists, becomes vehemently opposed to terminating the pregnancy, delivering a series of arguments so cartoonishly wrong that they serve as a fairly direct parody of a certain strain of American political discourse. At the end of the episode, Lois decides to have the abortion. That is the episode. That is the one Fox would not air. To understand why this is significant, you have to think about what Fox did air during Family Guy's run. Fox aired the episode where Peter and a barbershop quartet performed a cheerful song to a hospital patient about having contracted full-blown AIDS. Fox aired the episode where Peter burned down a black man's house out of jealousy. Fox aired the episodes where Meg was subjected to years of sustained, escalating abuse by her own family. Fox aired the episode where Brian lets a woman and her child drown in a sinking car because she turns out to be unavailable to date. Fox aired the episode where Peter shoves his wife underwater to escape a shark. Fox had, over many seasons, demonstrated an extremely generous and flexible definition of what constituted acceptable broadcast content when the show was generating reliable ratings. But an episode where a woman has an abortion, handled with what most people who have seen it describe as surprising care and thoughtfulness for Family Guy, that was the episode that crossed the line. The Fox network president at the time, Kevin Riley, was actually somewhat candid about the reasoning. And his candor is worth sitting with because it tells you something true and slightly uncomfortable about how American television works. Riley said, explicitly, that the decision was primarily financial. Of all the issues, he said in an interview, this is the one that seems to be the most of a hot button. Particularly at that moment in time, the economy was really struggling, and there were a lot of very tough conversations going on with clients. Advertisers. The people who pay for the airtime. Riley even acknowledged that he thought the episode handled the subject well. He did not say the episode was poorly made. He did not say it was irresponsible or dangerous. He said it was fine, but that it felt like it could cause trouble, and that it was not worth the trouble. The network that had aired hundreds of episodes of one of the most aggressively offensive comedies in television history had apparently located its absolute unwavering limit, and that limit was not gore, not sexual content involving minors, not jokes about dying patients, not sustained abuse of a teenage girl. The limit was a woman making a personal medical decision that advertisers might find uncomfortable. Seth MacFarlane was, predictably, unhappy about this. He told the New York Times that Fox was making a decision based on people's current ability to handle and dissect controversial narratives. He compared the abortion episode to the show's handling of gay marriage, of racial politics, of any number of other sensitive topics that Family Guy had addressed over the years. He pointed out correctly that there was a logical inconsistency in a network that would air episodes featuring graphic cartoon violence, but would refuse to air an episode about a woman's reproductive choices. The episode was eventually released on DVD and aired on BBC Three in the United Kingdom on June 20, 2010. Adult Swim, which had been Family Guy's savior during the show's years in cable purgatory, also declined to air it when Fox asked if they would. The episode remains, to this day, the only produced episode of Family Guy that has never aired on American television. It is not available on Hulu, the show's primary streaming home. It lives in a curious limbo, known to the fans who sought it out, invisible to the casual viewer. What makes the partial terms of endearment situation particularly interesting in the context of tonight's broader story is what it reveals about the nature of professional consequence in television. Nobody was fired over this episode. The writer kept his job. The showrunners kept their jobs. MacFarlane kept his deal with Fox. The episode simply did not air. It was a form of professional consequence, so understated that it almost does not register as a consequence at all. And yet something real happened. A creative team put genuine work into an episode. They were told, not by any aesthetic or ethical standard, but by the economics of advertiser comfort, that their work would not be seen. The specific thing they made, the particular argument they were making about abortion and comedy and American public life, was suppressed not because it was bad, but because it was inconvenient. MacFarlane has pointed to this moment as evidence of what he found increasingly frustrating about his relationship with Fox. Not just the network's interference in creative decisions, but the specific shape of that interference. The network had no problem with cruelty. It had no problem with shock. It had no problem with content that would generate complaints from parents' groups and religious organizations. What it had a problem with was content that might cost it advertising revenue. That distinction between aesthetic caution and financial caution is the kind of thing that can slowly erode a creator's relationship with the institution they work for. Danny Smith, the writer of Partial Terms of Endearment, had reportedly been inspired to write the script after Seth MacFarlane asked him to read a Carl Sagan essay about abortion. The piece by Sagan was thoughtful and nuanced, arguing that reasonable people could hold both pro-life and pro-choice positions simultaneously, while still affirming the fundamental importance of bodily autonomy. The episode attempted to engage with that nuance in the context of Family Guy's particular brand of absurdist satire. That engagement, that attempt at seriousness wrapped in the show's usual comedic register, was what Fox found too dangerous to broadcast. What Fox could not handle was not offense, it was sincerity. Section 4. The Boston Marathon, a viral hoax, and the episode that vanished. When we talk about content that ended careers or damaged them significantly, we usually mean content that was deliberately produced. A bad decision in a writing room. A script that went too far. A joke that landed in the wrong direction. These are the kinds of professional missteps that television writers and producers lose sleep over, because they are the missteps that are traceable back to specific choices made by specific people. But sometimes the damage comes from something adjacent. Something that was not the original piece of content at all, but became associated with it so completely that the two could not be separated in the public mind. On March 17, 2013, Family Guy aired an episode called Turban Cowboy. The episode's central story involved Peter befriending a Muslim man named Mahmoud after a skydiving accident. In the course of the episode, Mahmoud is revealed to be a radical terrorist. The episode also contained, as one of its disconnected cutaway gags, a brief scene in which Peter is interviewed about his performance in the Boston Marathon by Bob Costas, and a flashback reveals Peter driving his car through the marathon's runners to win the race. The Boston Marathon bombing occurred on April 15, 2013, exactly 29 days after Turban Cowboy first aired. In the immediate aftermath of the bombing, someone who has never been publicly identified edited together 2 scenes from Turban Cowboy. They took the marathon car scene and spliced it together with a separate scene from the same episode in which a character detonated bombs using a cell phone. The editing made it appear as though Peter was actively triggering explosions at the Boston Marathon. The clip was designed to look like evidence that Family Guy had predicted or somehow inspired or even celebrated the bombing. The clip spread with the speed that only truly dark, genuinely inflammatory internet content can achieve. Within hours, it was being shared by tens of thousands of people. The conspiracy theorist and radio host Alex Jones, who ran the website InfoWars, posted the video and used it as evidence for a claim that the Boston Marathon bombing was somehow connected to or anticipated by popular media. His audience, substantial and credulous, amplified the clip further. The original Family Guy episode, the actual context, the fact that the 2 scenes came from completely different storylines in the same episode, none of that information traveled at anywhere near the speed of the edited clip. Fox acted quickly. Within a day of the Boston bombing, the network pulled Turban Cowboy from Fox.com, from Hulu, from Amazon, and from their own website. They announced that the episode had no immediate plans to be broadcast again. The removal was total and swift, a kind of institutional reaction to a crisis that had very little to do with the actual content of the episode, and everything to do with the way that content had been weaponized by something that was not journalism, not commentary, and not critique, but rather deliberate, calculated misrepresentation. Seth MacFarlane responded on Twitter within 24 hours. His statement was unambiguous. The edited Family Guy clip currently circulating is abhorrent. The event was a crime and a tragedy, and my thoughts are with the victims. He called the edited clip what it was. He did not hedge. He did not equivocate. And his response was shared and amplified by other members of the Family Guy cast and crew, including Seth Green, who voices Chris Griffin. The writers of Turban Cowboy, Artie Johan and Sean Reese, found themselves in the specific, surreal purgatory of having their work cited in connection with a national tragedy that had nothing to do with them. The episode they had written was, by itself, already a fairly blunt and poorly executed piece of work. The AV Club gave it a grade of D. The reviewer at TV Fanatic gave it 2.5 stars out of 5. Critics largely found it dated, crude in a way that was not clever, and uncomfortable in its reliance on terrorist stereotypes. The episode was not good. But the episode was also not, in any way, connected to the Boston Marathon bombing. The people who made it had nothing to do with the bombing. The timing was coincidence. Pure, terrible, spectacular coincidence. What makes this story so worth sitting with is the question of what it cost. Artie Johan and Sean Reese did not lose their jobs over Turban Cowboy. The episode was eventually returned to Hulu in September 2022, 9 years after the bombing. Fox restored it to cable reruns before that. The episode exists today on various streaming platforms in countries outside the United States. Time and clarity eventually arrived, as they usually do. But for a period of days following the Boston Marathon bombing, the writers of Turban Cowboy watched a hostile, edited version of their work spread across every corner of the internet as evidence of something heinous. They watched their episode get pulled from every platform simultaneously. They watched the name of the show they worked on attached, in news coverage, to one of the most painful events in recent American history. Whatever professional damage that caused, whatever conversations it triggered in the Fox offices and in the Family Guy writers' room, whatever calculations it forced about what kinds of storylines were worth pursuing, and what kinds of coincidences a show about terrorism and violence could not afford, none of that is fully visible from the outside. What is visible is the shape of the damage. An episode that was already receiving poor reviews became permanently associated with a tragedy it had nothing to do with. The writers who made it became, briefly and unjustly, the subjects of a conspiracy theory. And the network that aired the show learned something specific and lasting about the costs of certain kinds of content, not because the content was wrong, not because the satire failed, but because the internet in 2013 had already become a place where context was entirely optional, and where edited video clips traveled at speeds that no public statement could match. The lesson was not about taste, it was about vulnerability. A show that constantly made jokes about violence, about terrorism, about large-scale human suffering had made itself vulnerable to exactly this kind of recontextualization. And when the recontextualization arrived, even though it was dishonest and malicious, the network could not afford to wait for the truth to catch up with the lie. The people who made Turban Cowboy paid for something they did not do. That is a particular kind of professional injustice, and it is one that the story of Family Guy's controversies tends to skip over, because it does not fit the neat narrative of creators facing consequences for their own bad choices. Sometimes the consequences are for someone else's bad choices entirely. Section 5. Patrick Warburton, and the line that could not be crossed. Let us talk about Patrick Warburton for a moment. Because Warburton's story is, in the larger mosaic of Family Guy controversies, one of the more quietly revealing ones. It does not involve a firing. It does not involve a tweet that went wrong or an episode that got banned. It involves a single moment in a recording booth, a single piece of dialogue in a single script, and a man who had been doing this job for over 2 decades standing up and saying, quietly and firmly, that he would not. Patrick Warburton is the voice of Joe Swanson, the wheelchair-using police officer who is one of Peter Griffin's 4 regular friends in the show's main cast. Warburton has voiced Joe since the very first season of Family Guy, from 1999 onward. He has, over that time, said things in that recording booth that would make most people blanch. He has delivered punchlines about Joe's disability. He has voiced characters making casually cruel comments about people with physical limitations. He has been part of an ensemble that regularly operated in territory that the Parents Television Council, which has filed dozens of complaints about the show over the years, considered deeply problematic. Warburton knew what he signed up for. He has said so explicitly. He understood from the very beginning that Family Guy was an aggressively offensive comedy, that it operated in space that was deliberately uncomfortable, and that his job was to serve the material whether or not it aligned with his own personal sensibilities. He is a lifelong Christian and a political conservative. His mother is actually a member of the Parents Television Council, the very organization that has been one of Family Guy's most persistent critics. Warburton knew the contradictions he was living, and he made his peace with them. But in a 2019 interview with Digital Spy, Warburton revealed that there was one moment, over 20 years of doing this job, when he could not make that peace. He would not identify the specific episode. He would not even repeat the line. What he would say was that it had to do with Christ on the cross, that it involved a depiction of the crucifixion, and that unlike the show's normal approach to religious content, which at least maintained some level of comedic irony or satirical distance, this particular joke had, in his view, no humor in it at all. It was just offensive. Not offensive in service of something. Just offensive as its own end. He said to the writers, in the politeness but firmness that comes from 20 years of working relationships, "I cannot participate in this episode." The line was not even a Joe Swanson line. It was not something his character was being asked to say. It was something another character said, in an episode that Joe appeared in. But Warburton felt strongly enough about it that he was willing to absent himself entirely from the episode. His character simply did not appear. The writers listened. They heard him. They understood. And by his own account, this happened once in 20 years. Once in hundreds of episodes. Once across a body of work that included some of the most deliberately offensive content in animated television history. What is interesting about the Warburton story is not the moment of refusal, remarkable as that moment is. What is interesting is what the moment reveals about the internal ecosystem of Family Guy, and the relationship between the creative team and the performers who bring their work to life. Warburton is not, based on everything he has said publicly, a man who demands creative control over the content he voices. He is a professional actor who trusts the writers and showrunners enough to deliver lines he personally finds distasteful, because he understands that the show is satire, and that satire operates by different rules than ordinary discourse. He has made this argument explicitly. He understands what Family Guy is. He chose to be part of it. But he also has, somewhere inside him, a line. A place where the distance between the character he is playing and the person he actually is collapses, where the frame of the fiction stops being enough of a buffer, where the specific content being asked of him is too much. And when he reached that place, he said so. Clearly. Respectfully. Without drama or ultimatum beyond the single simple statement of his own limits. And the writers who received that statement were, by Warburton's own account, completely understanding. They did not pressure him. They did not try to convince him that he was wrong, or that the joke was worth it. They knew how offensive the line was. They heard him and they continued. This is a story about professional boundaries, maintained with dignity. But it is also, if you think about it from a slightly different angle, a story about what kind of content was being generated in the Family Guy writing room during this period. The show had become, by the time this incident occurred, something that could write a joke offensive enough that a 20-year veteran, with an extremely high tolerance for offensive material, felt he could not participate in the episode containing it. That is not nothing. That is a data point about the trajectory of the show's relationship with its own worst impulses. We do not know which episode it was. We do not know which season, which writer, which precise moment in the show's history generated that line. Warburton will not say. He is careful about this. He acknowledges the humor in the fact that his own mother's organization has been trying to get Family Guy off the air for years, while he continues to collect a paycheck from it. He is aware of the irony in his own professional life. But the specific line, the one that crossed even his threshold, remains a mystery. It is the Family Guy joke that we will never know. And in some ways, its very unknowability makes it more significant, not less. Because the fact that it existed, the fact that it was written and produced and sent to the recording booth where it was read by a performer with 20 years of experience in this specific context, and found to be beyond the pale, tells you something about the kind of place Family Guy had become by its later seasons. Even the people inside it had limits. Even the most faithful and professional members of its cast had places they would not go. And the show, in its later years, had found ways to push past those places with enough regularity that someone who had never said no in 20 years had to say no at last. Section 6. Mike Henry, Cleveland Brown, and the reckoning with 2 decades of choices. On June 26, 2020, Mike Henry posted a short statement on Twitter that ended a 21-year professional chapter. "It's been an honor to play Cleveland on Family Guy for 20 years," he wrote. "I love this character, but persons of color should play characters of color. Therefore, I will be stepping down from the role." Simple, clean, decisive. 2 sentences of professional honesty followed by a period and a consequence. Mike Henry is white, Cleveland Brown is black. Mike Henry had been voicing Cleveland Brown since the first season of Family Guy in 1999. He had also voiced the character in the Family Guy spin-off, The Cleveland Show, which ran for 4 seasons on Fox between 2009 and 2013. During that time, he had voiced both Cleveland and Cleveland's stepson, Rallo Tubbs. He had been playing black characters in animated television for over 2 decades. And in the summer of 2020, in the weeks following the killing of George Floyd and the subsequent explosion of conversation about race, representation, and the specific ways that cultural institutions had historically failed Black Americans, Mike Henry decided that he was done. The context matters here. Henry was not responding to a public campaign demanding his resignation from the role. He was not reacting to a specific incident or controversy. He was, by his own account, making a decision that he believed was simply correct. That the character of Cleveland Brown, a major character in a long-running network television show, should be voiced by a black actor. That the practice of white actors voicing black characters in animation was a form of representation that had gone on too long, and that the moment had arrived to change it. This was happening in June 2020, with a kind of synchronized energy across animated television. Jenny Slate, who is white, announced she would no longer voice the biracial character Missy on Netflix's Big Mouth. Kristen Bell, also white, stepped back from voicing the biracial character Molly on Apple TV Plus's Central Park. The Simpsons announced that black characters on that show would no longer be voiced by white actors. Hank Azaria eventually stepped away from voicing the Indian character Apu, a process that had been years in the making following a documentary film about the character's problematic representation. The industry was doing something that the industry rarely does with any speed or sincerity. It was reconsidering itself. It was looking at practices that had been standard for decades and finding them wanting. Mike Henry's departure from the role of Cleveland Brown was, in retrospect, one of the cleaner and more graceful versions of this reckoning. He did not wait to be pressured. He did not make the announcement in response to external criticism. He made it because he believed it was right, and because the moment, culturally and professionally, had arrived when that kind of decision could be made publicly and clearly. He also handled the transition with evident care, welcoming his successor and explicitly expressing his desire for continuity and respect for the character. The successor, announced in September 2020, was Arif Zahir, a young black YouTuber who had built a following on the platform doing impressions of Cleveland Brown. Zahir had essentially spent years preparing for a role he could not have known he would ever be offered. His casting was a kind of poetic resolution. The person most qualified to voice Cleveland, by the standard of loving the character most, was also the person whose casting best served the standard of representation that Henry had identified. But let us sit with the more complicated part of this story for a moment. Because there is a version of what happened to Cleveland Brown that is not about Mike Henry's graceful exit. There is a version that is about what it meant for Family Guy to have spent 21 years building a major recurring character around the vocal performance of a white man doing a black voice. Cleveland Brown was never a simple character. In the early seasons, he was one of Peter's four regular friends, a soft-spoken, good-natured man whose quiet dignity was often played against Peter's chaos. Over the years, his character was developed further, given a full family, a complicated personal history, an entire spin-off series. He was, for a long stretch, one of the more prominent black characters in American animated comedy. And for all of that time, his voice was a white man doing a version of what a black character sounds like. The specific quality of Mike Henry's performance, the specific choices he made in voicing Cleveland, were not random. They reflected a set of decisions about how black speech and black identity translate into animated character, decisions made by a white man. That is not an accusation against Henry personally, who by all accounts genuinely loved the character. But it is a structural reality about what Family Guy was doing for 21 years. And it is a reality that the show's history cannot fully account for by pointing to Henry's graceful exit in 2020. The conversations that should have happened in 1999, when the show was being cast, did not happen. Or, if they happened, they did not produce the outcome they should have. A show that was always reaching for edginess and authenticity in its humor had built one of its central characters on a foundation of casual vocal appropriation that went unexamined for over 2 decades. Nobody lost their job over Cleveland Brown. Henry chose to leave and was celebrated for doing so. Zahir stepped into the role and by most accounts has done excellent work honoring the character. The show moved forward. The reckoning, such as it was, happened smoothly and without the kind of acrimony that these moments often generate. But the smoothness of the resolution should not obscure the significance of what it represented. It represented a show acknowledging 21 years into its run that a foundational casting decision had been wrong. Not maliciously wrong, not uniquely wrong compared to every other animated show of its era, but wrong in a way that had compounded quietly with every episode, every season, every year that Cleveland Brown remained a black character voiced by a white man on one of the most watched shows on American television. The professional consequence in this story is unusual. The consequence was freely chosen rather than imposed. But the underlying cause was real. Cleveland Brown's 21 years of being voiced by Mike Henry was a practice that could not survive contact with honest scrutiny. And when that scrutiny arrived, the right choice was made. That it took 21 years for the scrutiny to arrive is the part of the story that deserves to be remembered. Section 7. The Screams of Silence. Disaster. When the show got too real. Season 10, Episode 3. October 30th, 2011. The night before Halloween, the episode is called Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q. It was written by Alex Sulkin, the same writer who had posted the Pearl Harbor tweet about the Japanese earthquake 7 months earlier. It was directed by Dominic Bianchi. And it is, by the consensus of critics, fans, and television scholars who have studied Family Guy's history, one of the most deeply misguided episodes the show ever produced. Not because it was trying to be offensive, but because it was trying to be serious. The setup begins with a darkly comic scene. Glenn Quagmire, the show's resident sexual predator presented as comedic anti-hero, is found near death after an autoerotic asphyxiation accident involving clown pornography. He is hospitalized. While in the hospital, his sister Brenda arrives with her boyfriend Jeff. And from the moment Jeff appears on screen, the episode's tonal intentions become clear. Jeff hits Brenda. Jeff screams at Brenda. Jeff demeans and degrades Brenda in front of witnesses. Jeff is not presented as a comedic figure, not given the usual Family Guy ironic distance that allows the audience to laugh at bad behavior while simultaneously feeling superior to it. Jeff is presented as straightforwardly, realistically abusive. And Brenda, voiced by Caitlin Olsen, is presented as straightforwardly, realistically a victim of domestic violence. The episode attempts something that Family Guy is almost uniquely ill-equipped to attempt. It tries to engage with the emotional and psychological reality of an abusive relationship in a way that is both honest and entertaining. It wants the audience to feel the horror of what Brenda is experiencing, while also maintaining enough comedic energy to justify its existence as an episode of an animated comedy. It fails. Comprehensively, almost systematically, it fails. The television critic A.J. Hammer of Showbiz Tonight was among the first to articulate why. He said, live on his program the morning after the episode aired, that it was just a depressing half-hour of television. He brought in Wendy Walsh of The Doctors, who went further and identified the specific mechanism of the failure. Walsh said that the episode presented domestic violence through the lens of the victim's rationalization, making Brenda appear, in her words, as a poor stupid woman who was too dumb to leave her relationship. She said that domestic violence was far more complicated than that. That the show was depicting something that looked and sounded like real abuse, but was processing it as though it were a character flaw in the victim rather than a systemic, complicated, psychologically layered form of oppression. The critics were not wrong. There is a specific cruelty in an episode that uses domestic violence as its dramatic subject, but does not understand domestic violence well enough to portray it accurately. The episode shows Brenda making excuses for Jeff, attributing his behavior to stress or circumstance, defending him to her brother and his friends. This is realistic. Survivors of abuse frequently describe exactly this kind of internal logic as part of how abusive relationships sustain themselves. But the episode presents this realism without the surrounding context that makes it comprehensible, without the structural forces that keep people in abusive situations, without the economic and emotional and social factors that turn leaving into something enormously more complicated than simply walking out the door. Instead, the episode ends with Quagmire murdering Jeff. And while Jeff is portrayed as having thoroughly earned this fate, the resolution of a domestic violence storyline through extrajudicial killing is not exactly a model of thoughtful engagement with the subject matter. Brenda, at the episode's end, is devastated by Jeff's death. She mourns him. The irony of her mourning an abuser who is dead precisely because he was about to hurt her again is left unresolved, floating in the air above an episode that does not know what to do with it. The writer Alex Sulkin received considerable criticism for the episode in the days following its broadcast. The feminist website Jezebel published a piece with the headline, "Family Guy Hits Horrible New Low with Domestic Abuse Episode." Mediate published a piece comparing the episode to the two Family Guy episodes that Fox had previously refused to air, suggesting that this one should have received the same treatment. Multiple organizations working with survivors of domestic violence pushed back against the episode's portrayal. Sulkin was not fired. The episode continued to air in reruns for years afterward. But the damage to the show's reputation was real and lasting. In nearly every ranking of Family Guy's worst or most controversial episodes, Screams of Silence appears near the top. It became shorthand for a specific kind of failure. The failure that occurs when a show whose entire identity is built on irreverence and distance attempts sincerity and discovers that it has forgotten how. There is something worth noting about the timing. This episode aired 7 months after Sulkin's Pearl Harbor tweet. 7 months after a public humiliation that should have, in theory, sharpened his instincts about where the boundaries of acceptable content actually lie. 7 months after watching the internet remind him, loudly and collectively, that jokes about mass casualties have real effects on real people. And yet here was an episode, written by the same person, that bungled its engagement with domestic violence so badly that survivors of abuse came forward publicly to describe how harmful the portrayal was. Some lessons take longer to learn than others. Some require more than one public failure to fully arrive. What Screams of Silence ultimately cost was not a career, not a job, not a paycheck. What it cost was a measure of trust, the trust of viewers who had hoped that when Family Guy chose to engage with serious subject matter, it would do so with enough intelligence and care to make the engagement worthwhile. That trust, once lost, is harder to rebuild than almost any other professional currency. Section 8. The Transgender Episode, and What the Writers Knew They Were Doing. Season 8, Episode 11. Quagmire's Dad. It aired in May of 2010, the same season as the banned abortion episode. The plot involves Quagmire's father Dan, a Navy veteran, arriving in town for a visit. Peter and the guys immediately assume Dan is gay because of his effeminate mannerisms. They are wrong. It turns out Dan Quagmire is a transgender woman named Ida, who has come to town specifically to have gender confirmation surgery and to tell her son about the transition. What follows is an episode that was, at the time it was made, genuinely complicated in its relationship with the subject matter it was depicting. There are things the episode does that are, even by the more evolved standards of 2024, relatively thoughtful. Quagmire's initial reaction is portrayed as genuine pain and confusion, not cartoonish bigotry. He loves his father and is struggling to understand something that upends the image he has always had of the person who raised him. That confusion is handled with more nuance than the show usually managed. And then there is everything else. The other characters, Peter specifically, react to Ida with open contempt. They refer to her using language that was, even in 2010, considered by many transgender people and their advocates to be dehumanizing. The episode's most discussed moment involves Brian, the show's nominal voice of reason, having a romantic encounter with Ida before he knows she is transgender. When he discovers this, he spends an extended sequence vomiting. The joke is structured so that Brian's revulsion serves as the punchline, with the audience positioned to find his extreme physical reaction to having kissed a transgender woman funny. The episode aired. It did not cause anyone to lose their job. Fox broadcast it without the kind of intervention it had applied to the abortion episode 2 weeks later. But it generated significant criticism from LGBTQ advocacy groups, from media critics who covered representation in television, and from transgender commentators who pointed out that the Brian vomiting scene in particular reproduced the exact kind of disgust response that real transgender people encountered in their daily lives, not as a target of satire but as the punchline of the joke. This is a distinction that matters enormously. Family Guy has always operated as satire. Its defenders frequently argue that the show's offensive content is in service of exposing and mocking social prejudices, rather than endorsing them. When the show depicts Peter as racist or sexist or cruel, the argument goes, it is not celebrating those qualities, but lampooning them, holding them up for examination. But the Brian vomiting scene in Quagmire's Dad does not function as satire of anti-transgender prejudice. It functions as an expression of it. Brian's revulsion is not framed as something the audience should be skeptical of or critical of. It is framed as a reasonable, relatable response. The humor depends on the audience sharing, or at least understanding, the visceral disgust Brian experiences. Which means the episode is not satirizing transphobia. It is deploying transphobia as a comedic resource. The writers of the episode, Steve Callahan and Brian Scully, were not fired. The episode was not pulled from air. It continued to air in syndication for years. But it became, in the years following its initial broadcast, as conversation about transgender representation in media became more prominent. One of the examples most frequently cited when people discussed Family Guy's complicated relationship with the communities it depicted. In 2019, 9 years after Quagmire's Dad aired, the show announced that it would be phasing out gay jokes going forward. The announcement came in the episode Trump Guy, where Peter Griffin is seen telling a cartoon version of then President Donald Trump that the show was trying to phase them out. Executive producers Rich Appel and Alex Solkin publicly confirmed that this was a genuine policy change. McFarlane affirmed it, but there was no corresponding announcement about transgender content. No explicit acknowledgement that episodes like Quagmire's Dad had used transgender people and transgender experiences in ways that caused real harm. No institutional reckoning with the specific jokes that the episode had deployed. The phasing out of gay jokes was framed as a forward-looking decision, not a retrospective one. The episode remains in the show's catalog. The Brian vomiting scene remains part of that episode. And the writers who put it there remain, as far as public record indicates, employed in the television industry. What was lost here was not a career. What was lost was an opportunity to do something better, earlier. In a cultural moment when the show had enormous platform and enormous influence, and might have chosen to use that influence in a different way. The cost was borne not by the people who made the episode, but by the people the episode depicted, in the form of a joke about their existence that aired to millions of viewers on American network television. Section 9. South Park, the Manatees, and the professional humiliation that exposed everything. April 2006. The 10th season of South Park is airing on Comedy Central. And Trey Parker and Matt Stone, two creators who had been sharpening a specific set of knives for several years, decided that the moment had come to use them. The two-part episode Cartoon Wars aired on April 5th and April 12th, 2006. On its surface, it was about the Jillen's Poston Muhammad cartoon controversy. the worldwide crisis that had erupted when a Danish newspaper published 12 editorial cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad, provoking protests, riots, and deaths in multiple countries. Parker and Stone wanted to address the controversy directly, to put Muhammad in a South Park episode, to test whether Comedy Central would stand behind their right to make the argument they were making about free speech and religious satire. Comedy Central ultimately did not. They censored the depiction of Muhammad at the last moment, citing concerns about public safety, which sent Parker and Stone into a different kind of fury than any of their usual targets had ever managed to provoke. But here is the thing about Cartoon Wars. The Muhammad controversy was the frame, the vehicle, the ostensible subject. The actual target, the thing Parker and Stone had been building toward with the specific, methodical energy of people who had been waiting for exactly the right moment to say something they had been thinking for a very long time, was Family Guy. In the episode, Cartman goes to the Family Guy studios to prevent an upcoming episode from airing, ostensibly because he is concerned about Muslim retaliation. But his real motive is revealed quickly. He does not care about Muslims. He hates Family Guy. He hates Family Guy's writing. And when he finally gets inside the studio, the audience discovers the truth about how Family Guy's jokes are made. There are no writers. There is a large tank of water in the middle of the studio. In the tank swim manatees. On the floor next to the tank is an enormous pile of balls, each with a single word or phrase printed on it. A noun. A verb. A celebrity name. A pop culture reference. The manatees swim around and occasionally bump one of the balls into a slot in a machine, and the machine generates a cutaway gag. The manatees are the Family Guy writing staff. The ball selecting is the creative process. The brutality of this image is worth sitting with for a moment. It is not just saying that Family Guy's jokes are bad. It is saying that Family Guy's jokes are not the result of a human creative process at all. It is saying that the specific things that make Family Guy distinctive, the non sequitur references, the cutaway gags, the pop culture callbacks that seem to exist independently of any narrative logic, are not the product of thought or craft or intention. They are random. They are generated by an algorithm that could be replaced by aquatic mammals selecting objects from a pile, and the output would be identical. That is an extremely specific and extremely personal form of professional insult. And it landed. The Family Guy writers were not happy. By various accounts, the Cartoon Wars episode created significant tension in the Family Guy writing room. Some writers wanted to respond directly, to make a counter episode, to address the criticism publicly. There were conversations about what the right move was. MacFarlane ultimately decided that Family Guy would not fire back immediately, not in the episode format. He described this as a conscious choice not to waste the show's time on South Park. But there was a response. Of a kind. 3 years later, in the 2009 episode Spies Reminiscent of Us, Family Guy included a scene in which Peter and Quagmire attend an improv show. Peter does his usual Family Guy-style humor, random non sequiturs, and pop culture references and gags that have nothing to do with the situation at hand. The audience loves it. Quagmire tries a more South Park-style approach, satirical and pointed and thematically coherent. He gets a middling response. It was a counter-argument about comedy philosophy rather than a direct personal attack, and it was, by any honest assessment, somewhat less devastating than the original. The most telling response, though, came from MacFarlane himself during a commencement address at Harvard University in June 2006, a few weeks after Cartoon Wars had aired. He addressed the South Park criticisms in character as Stewie Griffin, saying that the cutaway gags had nothing to do with the story and were just there to be funny, that it was a shallow indulgence that South Park was quite above, and that he saluted them for it. It was the kind of self-aware response that can cut multiple ways. It could be read as MacFarlane genuinely acknowledging the validity of the criticism while framing it as a difference of philosophy rather than a failure of craft. It could be read as a graceful deflection, turning an attack into an opportunity for self-deprecating wit. Or it could be read as MacFarlane admitting, in the most high-profile venue he could have chosen, that the criticism was fair. That Family Guy's cutaway gags were genuinely disconnected from the stories they appeared in. That South Park's complaint about this was accurate. In a 2012 Rolling Stone interview, MacFarlane called the South Park episode funny and accurate. funny, and accurate. Those are two words that, put together in that way about a piece of content that mercilessly mocked your show's core creative approach, constitute a fairly significant concession. McFarlane was saying, yes, the manatee thing is true. The cutaways are not connected to the narrative. That is a thing about Family Guy. The professional consequences of cartoon wars were not in the obvious currency of firings and cancellations. Nobody lost their job because South Park made fun of their writing process. The Family Guy writers continued to work. The show continued to air. The cutaway gags continued to appear in volume, arguably in greater volume in the years following Cartoon Wars than in the years before it. But something happened to the way Family Guy was perceived by the industry after Cartoon Wars aired. The specific criticism that Parker and Stone had made, delivered with such precision and such wit and such evident pleasure, became a piece of received wisdom about the show. When critics wrote about Family Guy after 2006, many of them had the manatees in the back of their minds. When television writers at other shows talked about Family Guy in private, the manatee image was part of the vocabulary. The show that had been a phenomenon, a talking point, a genuine cultural force, became in certain conversations shorthand for something else. For a certain approach to comedy, for randomness over craft, for volume over intelligence, and the writers of the Family Guy room were the manatees. That is what they were called. Affectionately by some, and not affectionately by others. Inside the industry. People who worked on a show that had been publicly depicted as requiring no human intelligence to produce, because the intelligence, such as it was generated by selecting from a pool of pre-existing cultural references and arranging them in close enough proximity that something resembling a joke emerged. Did this affect the quality of the work that followed? That is impossible to measure directly. Institutional morale is not a variable that appears in any study of animated comedy. But it is worth noticing that the years following Cartoon Wars were precisely the years in which Family Guy's characters began their most significant transformations. When Peter became crueler, when Brian became more insufferable, when the cutaway gags got longer and more disconnected, when the show that had been built on a genuinely distinctive comedic voice started to sound more and more like an amalgamation of references, without a unifying sensibility behind them. Correlation is not causation. But the question is worth asking. What does it do to a writer's room when the most celebrated critique of their work reduces that work to a process that can be performed by animals? What does it do to a group of professional comedy writers to know that the rest of the television industry has seen an extremely funny and extremely pointed satire of their creative process, and that the person who made that satire has said publicly that he hates their show, and that the person who created their show has called the satire funny and accurate? Whatever it does not produce a room full of confident writers committed to the highest possible version of their craft. And the work that came out of the Family Guy room in the years following Cartoon Wars shows the effects of that loss of confidence in ways that are legible to anyone who watches carefully enough. The manatees, meanwhile, continue to select their idea balls. The machine continues to generate its gags. The show, decade after decade, continues to air. Section 10. The Fox relationship, a creator trapped in his own creation. There is a specific kind of professional trap that successful creators sometimes fall into, and the trap has no clean name because it does not need one. Anyone who has ever spent years building something knows it by feel. You make something. The something succeeds. The success generates obligations. The obligations accumulate into a structure that begins to look less like the thing you built and more like the thing the market built around what you made. And at some point, you look up from inside the structure and realize that the person who is most constrained by its existence is you. Seth MacFarlane has been living in this trap for well over a decade. In 2018, MacFarlane posted a now-deleted tweet saying he was embarrassed to work for the company that employed Tucker Carlson, after Carlson told his viewers to always assume the opposite of whatever the big news stations were telling them. MacFarlane was not making a subtle or ambiguous statement. He was saying publicly, in his own name, that his professional affiliation with Fox was something he was ashamed of. That the specific values and practices of the broader Fox media organization were in direct conflict with his own. This is an extraordinary thing for a creator to say about the network that made him famous and continues to air his most successful show. It is the kind of statement that, under most circumstances, costs people their professional relationships. Networks do not like being embarrassed by the people they pay to make content for them. Television executives do not typically respond well to their most prominent showrunners publicly calling the company embarrassing. But MacFarlane was not fired. He was not disciplined. His shows continued to air. Fox continued to renew Family Guy. And the reason for this is not complicated. Family Guy, even in its diminished rating state, generates enormous amounts of revenue in syndication, streaming, merchandise, and international licensing. The show's value to Fox is not primarily the 2 or 3 million people who watch new episodes on whatever night they happen to be airing in whatever season is current. The show's value is the enormous, decades-deep catalog of content that runs constantly on Adult Swim, FXX, Comedy Central, and countless international networks. The brand, the intellectual property, the specific ecosystem of recognizable characters and recurring scenarios that has been built across more than 400 episodes. Fox was not going to throw that away because MacFarlane posted an uncomfortable tweet. In January 2020, MacFarlane signed a $200 million 5-year deal with NBC Universal, specifically with a division called Universal Content Productions. He moved his production company, Fuzzy Door Productions, to NBC Universal's platform. His new projects, the Orville and the Ted series, were being developed and produced under the NBC umbrella. His future was, to the greatest extent possible, given the existing contractual obligations of Family Guy and American Dad, somewhere other than Fox. And yet Family Guy remained on Fox. MacFarlane continued to voice his characters. He continued to have his name attached to the show as creator. He continued to receive credit and, presumably, compensation. But the creative decisions, the story choices, the specific jokes, and the specific moments, and the specific direction in which the characters were being pushed, those were happening in a room that he did not sit in, steered by people whose sensibilities were not his. In August 2021, when Tucker Carlson published another opinion piece that MacFarlane found objectionable, MacFarlane posted what became one of the more widely circulated statements of his career. He wrote, "Tucker Carlson's latest opinion piece once again makes me wish Family Guy was on any other network. Look, Fox, we both know this marriage isn't working anymore. The sex is only once a year, I don't get along with your mother, and well, I've been having an affair with NBC. This is a remarkable thing to say publicly about a professional relationship. It uses the language of a deteriorating marriage, with all of the implications of intimacy violated, obligations maintained without desire, and infidelity as the ultimate expression of alienation." MacFarlane was saying, in terms that were simultaneously witty and genuinely hurt, that the relationship between himself and Fox had become hollow. That the show bearing his name was living in a house with a network he fundamentally disagreed with. That he had already emotionally and professionally moved on to NBC and was only still at Fox because the contractual and financial realities of a show that had been on the air since 1999 did not allow him to simply walk away. The writers at Fox heard this. The executives at Fox heard this. The writers' room, which did not include MacFarlane in any meaningful creative capacity, heard it. And they all continued working on the show regardless, because the show existing as a going concern required them to, and because the money was still there, and because the structure around the show was solid enough to persist, regardless of how its creator felt about its corporate home. This is the specific professional trap that MacFarlane had been inside for years, and that the 2021 tweet made visible in a way that could not be walked back. He was the creator of a show he did not write, airing on a network he found embarrassing, produced under a studio banner whose values conflicted with his own, still bearing his name, and still generating income that funded projects he actually wanted to make. He could not leave. The show was bigger than him in the ways that commercial success always eventually makes things bigger than the people who built them. It had a life independent of his involvement. It would continue to air whether he was enthusiastic about it or not. In April 2025, it was announced that Family Guy had been renewed for 4 more seasons, taking it through season 27 and the 2028 to 2029 television season. The deal was described as a mega deal with parent company Disney, which had acquired many of the Fox assets over the preceding years. Each season would consist of 15 episodes. The show's 30th anniversary was, in theory, being planned for. When MacFarlane was asked about this development, He was consistent with the framing he had used in recent years. He talked about the show in terms of its utility rather than its artistry. He said that it helped fund causes he cared about, like environmental conservation through organizations like the Rainforest Trust. He said it made people happy. He said it had reached what he called escape velocity, having been running long enough that there was no logical reason to end it unless the audience stopped caring. These are not the words of a creator who is excited about what he is making. These are the words of a person who has found a way to make peace with an obligation that no longer brings him creative satisfaction by attaching it to causes and purposes that do exist. Family Guy is a financial vehicle for environmental conservation. It is a product that keeps other people employed. It is a machine that generates merchandise revenue and syndication fees. It is the show that people still associate with Seth MacFarlane, even when the show that people associate with Seth MacFarlane has, for well over a decade, been primarily the product of other people's creative labor. The trap is not going to open. The show will continue to air until the economics stop making sense. MacFarlane will continue to voice his characters and receive his credit and cash his checks. The Family Guy that the audience watches will continue to be made by a room of writers working in the shadow of a creator who has publicly expressed his discomfort with where they are airing, without the daily presence of the creative intelligence that gave the show its original voice. In a corporate environment that has managed to hold together a 25-year professional relationship, primarily through the force of contractual obligation and the inertia of profitable intellectual property. That is not a tragedy exactly. But it is a story. And it is, in its way, one of the most honest stories about what happens to creative work when it succeeds beyond the capacity of its creator to contain it. Section 11. The AIDS episode, the Veterans Memorial, and the jokes that went too far in both directions. Not all of the jokes that cost Family Guy something came from the obvious places. Some of the most revealing moments in the show's long history of controversy came from jokes that were not trying to be cruel at all, jokes that were trying to use darkness as a vehicle for something genuine, and discovered in the process that the vehicle was not built for the weight it was being asked to carry. Season 4, Episode 2. Fast Times at Buddy Cianci Jr. Hi. This was one of the early revival-era episodes, part of the fourth season that aired after the show's return from cancellation in 2005. In the episode, Peter demonstrates what he calls his ability to deliver bad news. It leads to a cutaway gag. Peter and a barbershop quartet stand at the foot of a hospital bed. In the bed is a patient. Peter and the barbershop quartet begin to sing, cheerfully, that the patient has tested positive for what they describe as full-blown AIDS. The song is genuinely catchy. That is part of why the moment became one of the most discussed controversies in the show's early revival years. The specific horror of the joke, the thing that made it impossible to dismiss as mere tastelessness, was that it was well constructed. Someone had taken care with the melody. The harmonies were good. The timing was impeccable. This was not a joke that felt like it had been thrown together carelessly. This was a joke that felt like it had been written by people who were genuinely skilled, applying that skill to something that a significant number of people in the audience had experienced not as an abstract topic, but as a part of their actual lives. AIDS service organizations were not amused. Multiple organizations that worked with people living with HIV and AIDS, organizations that had spent years fighting the stigma and shame that had attached itself to the disease since the epidemic began, pushed back immediately and vocally. Their argument was not simply that the joke was offensive. Though it was offensive, their argument was more specific and more damaging, that the joke reproduced the exact form of humiliation that people with AIDS had been subjected to in real life. That the image of someone's medical status being announced in a public, performative, cheerful way had not always been a theoretical scenario. That for a significant number of people in the audience, this was not an absurdist flight of fancy, but a very direct echo of something real. The DVD commentary for the episode, recorded later, is revealing. The writers acknowledged on that commentary track that the song was made intentionally tasteless so the joke would work. They knew it was going to land hard. They made a deliberate choice to lean into the discomfort, rather than away from it, on the theory that the extremity of the performance was itself part of the comedy. They were not entirely wrong, in a narrow technical sense. The joke does work if you evaluate it purely as a piece of comedic construction. The gap between the upbeat musical presentation and the devastating content is large enough, and the execution skilled enough, that a certain kind of viewer will laugh in spite of themselves. This is the mechanism of dark comedy when it is functioning correctly. You laugh because the joke has surprised you into it, before the part of your mind that keeps track of what is actually happening has had time to object. But the part of your mind that keeps track of what is actually happening did have time to object for a significant portion of the audience. And their objection was real and documented and produced exactly the kind of institutional pushback that the show's broader controversy history suggests was increasingly common in the post-revival years. Nobody was fired over the AIDS Barbershop Quartet song. The DVD commentary reveals no regrets, no rethinking, no sense that the people who made it felt they had misjudged the situation. They made a deliberately tasteless joke about a disease that had killed millions of people, and they stood behind it. What it cost was more diffuse than a fired writer or a pulled episode. It cost in the currency of trust, specifically the trust of the communities that Family Guy had always been at least nominally claiming to satirize, rather than simply mock. The AIDS joke was not a joke about AIDS stigma. It was not a joke about the cultural failure to respond to the epidemic adequately. It was not using the disease as a vehicle to say something true about how American society had handled it. It was just a joke about the awkwardness of delivering a terminal diagnosis, dressed in a musical presentation, with the disease itself as the shocking kicker. The shock was the joke. The disease was the prop. That is a different thing from dark comedy, and the AIDS organizations that pushed back were pointing at that difference. Contrast this with Season 8, the episode Partial Terms of Endearment, the one Fox refused to air. The difference between those two episodes, in terms of their relationship to their subject matter, is significant. Partial Terms was written by someone who had read a Carl Sagan essay about the subject, who had thought carefully about the philosophical dimensions of what they were depicting, who was trying, however imperfectly, to use the comedy frame to explore something real about how Americans argue about reproductive rights. The AIDS Barbershop Quartet was not written by someone who had done equivalent preparation. It was written by someone who thought the contrast between cheerful song and devastating news would generate a laugh. And they were right, and that was apparently the extent of the analysis. The distance between those two approaches is the distance between a show that occasionally does something thoughtful and a show that has decided that shocking the audience is sufficient justification for any content. Family Guy, in its post-revival years, increasingly occupied the second position. And the moments when it slipped into the first position, when it actually tried to be thoughtful about a difficult subject, those moments stood out precisely because they were so unusual. There is also Season 8 of the show, the episode The Splendid Source, which contains what many critics consider one of the most genuinely disturbing cutaway gags in the show's history. The gang takes a road trip to Washington, D.C., and drives past the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Peter points out a Vietnamese man apparently behaving offensively near the memorial wall. The scene cuts to two American veterans visiting the memorial, quietly looking for their fallen friend's name. They find it. There is a moment of genuine emotion, and then a Vietnamese veteran appears, begins taunting them, points to a specific name on the wall, and claims responsibility for that person's death. The joke turns the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, one of the most emotionally significant public monuments in the United States, into the backdrop for a scene of direct taunting of American veterans. The veterans in the scene are depicted being mocked in front of the names of their dead friends by someone who claims to have killed those friends, and this is played as comedy. The response from veterans organizations was significant. Multiple groups pushed back against the episode. The specific nature of the complaint was that the scene reduced one of the most sacred physical spaces in American memorial culture to a setting for adversarial taunting, with the dead soldiers on the wall serving as points in a scorekeeper's argument. That the scene, whether it intended to or not, communicated a particular contempt for the specific grief that the memorial represents. Again, nobody lost their job. The episode aired. It continues to air. But the veterans organizations that responded publicly were pointing at something real about the specific choice the writers had made. Not about the idea of dark comedy involving the Vietnam War, which has produced some extraordinary art, but about the use of that specific physical space, with those specific names, as the backdrop for that specific joke. Family Guy has always been drawn to the most loaded, the most emotionally charged, the most culturally significant targets for its humor. That is part of what made the early show so electric. The sense that nothing was truly off limits, that the show was willing to go places that other comedy would not. But the difference between the early show and the later one, the crucial difference that the critics who followed the show's decline were always trying to articulate, was that the early show went to those places with something to say, with a perspective, with a willingness to implicate itself in the discomfort as well as the target. The later show went to the same places and discovered that the mere act of going there was no longer sufficient. That the audience had, over years of exposure, become somewhat inoculated to the shock. That the spaces that had once produced genuine, complicated laughter were now producing something shallower. A recognition that the show was doing the thing it always did, in a context that no longer felt as charged or as necessary as it once had. The jokes that cost Family Guy the most were not always the ones that got episodes pulled or people fired. Sometimes the highest cost was paid by jokes that aired without incident, jokes that generated controversy, and then settled back into the catalog and continued to air in reruns, contributing to a gradual erosion of the show's claim to be doing something with intention. Something beyond filling 22 minutes of television with content that would avoid legal action while generating enough buzz to stay in the conversation. The AIDS Barbershop Quartet, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Scene, the domestic violence episode, the Boston Marathon cutaway, the transgender storyline, the Trayvon Martin episode, the banned abortion episode. These are not random. They form a pattern. They are the shape of a show that was perpetually reaching for the most significant, the most painful, the most culturally loaded material available, and perpetually failing to handle it with the care that material deserved. Not because the people making the show were bad people, though the Pearl Harbor tweet suggests at least one of them had serious lapses in judgment, but because they were working in a system that rewarded reaching for the loaded material and did not consistently reward the care. The care takes time. The care requires research and consultation and revision, and a willingness to make the harder creative choice when the easier one is available. The care produces episodes like Brian and Stewie, brilliant and unusual, and clearly the product of someone caring deeply about what they were making. And the care, in a writer's room, producing more than a dozen episodes a season year after year after year, is the first thing that gets sacrificed when the production schedule tightens. That is not an excuse, but it is an explanation. And the people whose careers were touched by the consequences of Family Guy's failures in care? The writers who faced public humiliation? The actors who had to make decisions about their participation? The communities who watched themselves depicted carelessly? They all existed inside that explanation, without having any power to change the system that produced it. Section 12. The Writers Guild, the Network, and the rupture that changed the show forever. November 2007. The Writers Guild of America goes on strike. Before we get into what the strike cost Family Guy specifically, it is worth spending a moment with the geography of the writer's room, because the geography of a writer's room is everything. Television comedy writing is a genuinely collaborative art form in a way that most creative work is not. It is not like novel writing, where a person sits alone and generates something from their own internal resources. It is not like directing, where a vision exists in someone's head and other people execute it. It is a room. A physical room with a table and chairs and a whiteboard and a coffee situation and a set of people who show up at the same time and spend 8 to 12 hours together arguing about what is funny, about what is true, about whether this joke works or that one, whether this character would actually say that thing, whether this story has enough heart, whether this cutaway is the right one here, or whether there is a better cutaway somewhere. The room has a voice. Over time, the room develops a specific sensibility, a shared understanding of what the show is and what it is not, what it is allowed to do and what it cannot do, without betraying something essential about itself. This shared understanding is not written down. It is not in any manual or style guide. It lives in the room, in the people who come to it every day, in the accumulated history of every argument they have had and every joke they have written, and every moment when someone said, "No, that is not us," and the room heard it, and moved on. When a writer's room breaks apart, that shared understanding scatters with it. The people who held it carry pieces of it away with them to other projects and other rooms. What reassembles is a new room, made up of some of the same people and some new ones, and it tries to reconstitute the shared understanding from the evidence left behind. From the previous episodes, from the Bible, if there is one, from the conversations with the Creator, if the Creator is available, but the reconstitution is never perfect. Something is always lost in the translation. Some subtle instinct, some unspoken knowledge about what the show was that does not survive the gap. Family Guy broke apart twice before the 2007 WGA strike. It was canceled after its third season in 2002, which scattered the original writing staff completely. People found other work. Some left the industry. Some moved to other shows. When the show was revived in 2005, the room that assembled was not the original room. It had some of the same people and manatee. The voice it developed was different from the original voice. Not dramatically, not in ways that were obvious from any single episode, but different in the ways that all assembled voices are different from the original. Then came the strike. The 2007 to 2008 WGA strike began in November and lasted until February of 2008, a period of approximately 100 days. For the Family Guy writing staff, those 100 days were a dispersal. Writers who had been in that room together, who had been developing that shared understanding, who had been in the process of figuring out what season 6 and 7 wanted to be, scattered to their lives, to their families, to the picket lines, to the other projects they had been holding on the back burner, to the worry that every striking worker carries, the quiet, persistent worry that the strike might last long enough to change things in ways that cannot be reversed. McFarlane was on the picket lines. He was a strong advocate for the WGA's position. He had been through a previous labor action, and he understood what was at stake. His support was genuine, and his presence on the lines was a real statement of solidarity. And then Fox, as described earlier, made the decision to air 3 completed Family Guy episodes without his approval. The professional significance of this decision extends beyond the immediate insult of having your work broadcast against your wishes. It created a public record of exactly where the lines of power in the McFarlane-Fox relationship actually fell. McFarlane had, by 2007, become one of the most successful and highest-profile creators in Fox's animated lineup. He had revived a show from cancellation. He had turned it into a cultural phenomenon. He had a second show, American Dad, running simultaneously. He had enormous goodwill from the audience and from the creative community. And when it came to a direct conflict between his wishes and Fox's financial interests won. Immediately, without apparent hesitation, McFarlane described the decision as a colossal act of corporate disrespect. That is the kind of characterization that does not fade. It becomes part of the story you tell yourself about a relationship. And when you tell yourself that story often enough, the relationship becomes defined by it. The strike ended in February 2008. The room reassembled. The show resumed production. But the room that came back together in early 2008 was already different from the room that had scattered in November 2007, which was itself different from the room that had made the early revival seasons, which was different from the original room. Each disruption left a residue of difference. Each gap produced a slightly altered version of the shared understanding. Each new writer who joined the room, and each original writer who had left, brought the overall voice of the show further from whatever it had been at its origin. The episodes that came out of the post-strike period show this. Season 7, which ran from 2008 to 2009, is generally regarded by critics and longtime fans as the season in which the show's decline became something that could no longer be explained away as temporary or circumstantial. The writing was looser. The characters were less consistent. The balance between heart and shock, which had never been perfectly maintained even in the good years, had tilted further in the direction of shock. The jokes were louder, and the feeling was quieter. There is no single episode from Season 7 that encapsulates this shift the way that later seasons would produce their crystallizing disasters. It was more diffuse than that. A general softening of the show's specific identity, a generalizing of its voice into something less distinct. Family Guy was beginning to sound like an animated comedy, rather than this particular animated comedy. The thing that had made it different from everything else was fading. Slowly. Season by season, and the WGA strike, like the cancellations before it, had accelerated the fade. When the 2023 WGA strike hit, the pattern repeated itself with different specific details, but the same basic structure. MacFarlane walked out. He was seen on the picket lines. The production company was told that none of the showrunners or MacFarlane himself would work until the strike ended. Family Guy had just completed its 21st season and was not immediately at risk of running out of completed content. The studio had time to figure out what happened next. The 2023 strike lasted nearly 5 months, from May to September. It was one of the longest and most consequential WGA strikes in the organization's history, ultimately producing a new agreement that addressed concerns about streaming compensation, the use of artificial intelligence in writing, and the erosion of writers' room structures that had been standard for decades. Many of the things that writers had been concerned about, that their compensation had not kept pace with the industry's transformation, that studios were looking for ways to reduce their dependence on human writers, were addressed in the agreement. MacFarlane's support for the 2023 strike, like his support for the 2007 strike, was consistent and genuine. And like the 2007 strike, it produced a period of disruption in Family Guy's production process that will show up, at some remove, in the quality and character of the work that follows it. What the strikes have taught us, cumulatively, about Family Guy is something about the relationship between institutional stability and creative quality. The show was at its best when the room was most stable, when the people in it had been there long enough to develop that shared understanding, when the disruptions were minimal and the accumulated knowledge of what the show was allowed to do had time to compound. The show was at its worst in the immediate aftermath of disruptions, when the room was reassembling around people who were still figuring out what they had in common. Stability in a writer's room is not glamorous. It does not generate press releases or Emmy nominations in the way that individual brilliant episodes do. But it is the invisible foundation of everything else. And Family Guy, across its entire history, has had remarkably little of it. 15,000 writers walk off the job. They are fighting for better compensation from DVD sales, from digital distribution, from the emerging streaming services that were already beginning to reshape how people consume television. The studios had been profiting from reruns and DVD releases in ways that the writers' contracts had not accounted for, and the writers wanted their share. Seth MacFarlane was unambiguous in his support. He joined the picket lines. He made public statements. He had been an advocate for the Guild during previous labor actions, and he was going to be an advocate now. And then Fox made a decision that MacFarlane described, with characteristic precision, as a colossal act of corporate disrespect. Fox had several completed Family Guy episodes in the can when the strike began, episodes that had been written and produced before the walkout. Technically, the network had the right to broadcast them. The scripts had been completed. The animation had been done. MacFarlane's voice performances were already recorded. Nothing about airing these episodes technically required the participation of any striking writer. Fox aired them, against MacFarlane's explicit wishes, without his approval, on his show, featuring his characters, voiced in part by him. This was not illegal. It was not even strictly speaking a violation of any contractual agreement. It was, however, exactly the kind of action that reveals the true nature of a professional relationship. Fox was telling MacFarlane, in the clearest possible terms, that Family Guy ultimately belonged to Fox, that his creative ownership of the show had real limits, that when the network's financial interests conflicted with his personal principles, the network's financial interests would win. MacFarlane did not forget this. The rupture it created between him and Fox did not close quickly or completely. In the years that followed, his public statements about the network became increasingly frank about his discomfort with the association. He made no secret of his frustration with the fact that Family Guy aired on the same network that owned Fox News. In 2021, he posted publicly on social media that Tucker Carlson's commentary made him wish Family Guy was on any other network. He used the phrase that would become the headline in dozens of articles. It was like a failing marriage where both sides knew it was not working. The WGA strike, which lasted from November 2007 to February 2008, approximately 100 days, did specific and lasting damage to the Family Guy writing room. Television writing is a process of maintained momentum, of shared context and developing story instincts, of a group of people who spend enormous amounts of time together building a common voice. When that process is interrupted for 3 months, when writers scatter to other projects and other obligations in other rooms, the voice that reassembles after the strike ends is not quite the same voice that existed before it started. The episodes produced in the immediate aftermath of the strike, the back half of Season 6 and early Season 7, showed the strain. The writing felt less cohesive. The character work was more inconsistent. The tonal balance between heart and shock, never easy for Family Guy to maintain even in its best periods, started tilting more definitively toward shock. The strike also accelerated the departure of original writing staff that had already begun during the show's rocky early years. Each disruption, each cancellation, each strike or network conflict that scattered the room made it harder to maintain the specific institutional memory of what the show was supposed to be and who these characters were at their core. The people who knew why early Peter was a lovable fool, rather than a cruel one, were fewer and fewer. The people who remembered why early Stewie was terrifying, rather than cute, were scattered. Nobody was fired because of the WGA strike. But the strike was part of the ecosystem of damage that gradually transformed Family Guy from a show with a coherent creative vision into a show that was producing content primarily by momentum and market logic. The institutional costs of labor disputes in television are rarely calculated in the obvious currencies of lost jobs and canceled shows. They are calculated in the subtler currency of lost voice, of the specific, irreplaceable knowledge that leaves a writer's room when writers leave a writer's room. In 2023, the WGA went on strike again. McFarlane again walked off the show, again stood on the picket lines, again made his position clear. This time the strike lasted nearly 5 months, from May to September. And again, the damage to Family Guy's production process was real, measured in delayed seasons and interrupted creative work, even if it was not visible in any single dramatic public event. The pattern across both strikes is the same. The show's creator chooses the writers over the network. The network exercises its contractual rights over the creator's objections. The professional relationship sustains damage that never fully heals. And the show itself, caught in the middle, absorbs that damage in ways that show up not in press releases or legal documents, but in the texture of the work itself. Section 13. The Boston bombing writers, career arcs, and the human cost of topical comedy. When you work in topical comedy, when your job is to take the raw material of contemporary American life and turn it into jokes that will air on national television in roughly 6 to 9 months, you are always writing in the shadow of your own limitations. The limitation is time. Or more precisely, the limitation is the gap between the moment when you write the joke and the moment when the audience hears it. In that gap, the world continues to exist. Events continue to happen. The specific piece of reality you have chosen to make funny can change its meaning entirely. The writers of Turban Cowboy knew they were writing an episode about terrorism and about Muslim stereotypes. They knew they were writing an episode set in part at the Boston Marathon. What they could not have known was that 30 days after their episode aired, a terrorist attack would occur at the Boston Marathon. The gap between their writing and the world's reality collapsed in the most terrible possible way. But there is another version of this story that is less about coincidence and more about judgment. The writers of Turban Cowboy made specific choices. They chose to write a plot in which a Muslim character is revealed to be a terrorist, which is exactly the kind of reductive, lazy stereotype that critics of the episode noted even before the bombing. The AV Club reviewer who gave the episode a D was not responding to the bombing. He was responding to the episode itself, to its reliance on a portrayal of Muslim characters as uniformly associated with terrorism that felt, in his words, like an episode written in 2002 and left on the shelf for a decade. The bombing made the episode impossible to continue broadcasting in the immediate term. But the critical failure the reviewer identified was present in the episode regardless of what happened in Boston. The bombing transformed a poorly conceived episode about terrorism into a piece of content associated with a real act of mass violence. But the poor conception was there from the beginning. Artie Johan and Sean Rees, who wrote the episode, did not lose their jobs. They continued working in television. Their careers survived the specific, catastrophic bad luck of having their work caught in the crossfire of history. But the episode they made stands as a permanent artifact of a certain kind of creative failure. The failure to ask whether the subject matter you are engaging with deserves more care than you are giving it. The Family Guy Writers' Room has produced episodes about almost every form of human suffering. Episodes about addiction, suicide, domestic violence, racial violence, terminal illness, the deaths of children, the collapse of marriages. Some of these episodes are genuinely brilliant, finding the precise angle from which a dark subject becomes illuminating rather than merely dark. The episode Brian and Stewie, in which the two characters are locked in a bank vault and have extended, honest conversations about depression and meaning, is universally considered one of the best episodes the show ever made. It has no cutaway gags, it has no shock value, it has just two characters talking about their lives with more honesty than the show usually allows. The writers who made Brian and Stewie and the writers who made Turban Cowboy were working for the same show in the same building, with the same resources and the same mandate. The difference between those two episodes is the difference between caring about what you are making and not caring. Between asking whether the subject matter you have chosen deserves your best thinking, and assuming that the subject matter will carry the episode on its own. That difference, playing out across hundreds of episodes over more than 2 decades, is ultimately what cost Family Guy the thing that is hardest to get back once it is gone. Not ratings, though the ratings cratered. Not critical esteem, though the critics eventually stopped taking the show seriously. What it cost was the sense, present in the early seasons, that there were people in that building who cared about what they were making, who understood that comedy was a craft requiring judgment and skill and care, who knew the difference between a joke that illuminates something true about human experience and a joke that just takes up airtime. The writers who made the great episodes are part of Family Guy's story, so are the writers who made the terrible ones. Both kinds of people were employed by the same show, sat in the same room, cashed the same paychecks. The only thing that separated them was the quality of the choices they made when nobody was watching. Section 14. The Simpsons crossover scene that had to be cut. And what it revealed. In September 2014, in an episode celebrating the 13th season of Family Guy, something happened that even by the show's extraordinary standards required intervention from the people who were supposed to be keeping watch. The episode was the long-anticipated crossover between Family Guy and The Simpsons, two animated institutions that had been circling each other with a mixture of competitive tension and mutual awareness since Family Guy first aired in 1999. The crossover was a major pop culture event, promoted heavily by Fox, anticipated eagerly by fans of both shows. And someone in the Family Guy writers' room wrote a scene in which Glenn Quagmire sexually assaults Marge Simpson. Not implied, not suggested. A scene in which Quagmire, the show's sexual predator character, appears, and Marge is shown being chased and then attacked, and in the aftermath, Quagmire murders every member of the Simpson family. The scene was cut before broadcast. Fox pulled it. The episode that aired did not contain this scene. But the scene existed. It was written by someone, pitched in a room where other people heard it, added to a script, animated at a cost of hundreds of thousands of dollars, and reviewed by producers before someone finally determined that it could not air. The specific chain of events that led to its creation and its removal remains largely opaque from the outside. Nobody has been publicly identified as the writer who pitched it. Nobody was publicly disciplined for including it. The episode aired, was watched by enormous numbers of people, received generally mixed to positive reviews, and was noted in many publications for a separate rape joke. The Hollywood Reporter specifically called out the episode's treatment of a sexual assault reference in the context of a joke between Peter and Homer. What the cut Quagmire scene reveals, in its existence rather than its broadcast, is something about the internal culture of the Family Guy writers' room during this period. The scene was generated. It passed through multiple filters without being stopped. Filters that included writers, producers, animation supervisors, and Fox Standards and Practices representatives. It got far enough into the production process to be animated before someone with the authority to stop it did so. This is not a story about a single bad writer having a single bad idea. A single bad idea in a television writer's room gets killed the first time it is mentioned, if the room is functioning well. This scene made it through the animation phase. It was a significant financial investment in content that ultimately had to be destroyed. The culture that allows that kind of content to get that far along in production is a culture that has lost some essential judgment about what is acceptable. Not merely edgy, not merely offensive, but genuinely acceptable as the output of a show that is being broadcast to millions of people on a network that has advertisers and legal obligations and a responsibility not to be actively harmful. Nobody was fired over the cut Simpsons crossover scene. The episode aired, the scene stayed cut, and the production moved on. But it is there in the record of what Family Guy was willing to create during its later seasons, evidence of a creative environment that had, in certain respects, stopped regulating itself in the ways that a creative environment requires to stay healthy. A few months later, Seth MacFarlane was asked about his level of involvement in the writing of the show at that point. His answer was illuminating in its honesty. He said that he had not been actively writing for Family Guy since around 2009, that the day-to-day work, the room, the scripts, the specific jokes, had been in other hands for years, that he came to the recording sessions, that he voiced his characters, that he remained connected to the show in the way that a creator remains connected to something they built, but that the content being produced was not his content in the way that the early seasons had been. The Quagmire Marge Simpson scene was produced during that period, by those other hands. Without the specific judgment that had been in the room during the show's best years. That is not an excuse. There are no excuses for content that had to be destroyed before broadcast because it depicted the sexual assault and murder of beloved characters from another show. But it is an explanation. And explaining what happened is necessary to understanding it. Section 15. The lasting legacy: what Family Guy cost and what it left behind. It is late now. Or early, depending on your perspective. The room around you has probably gone very quiet. The stories we have been sitting with tonight have moved through 25 years of a show that changed American comedy. And then, by degrees and choices and failures of judgment, changed into something its creator might not fully recognize. What we have been tracking across all of these stories is not simply a catalog of bad jokes and their consequences. We have been tracking something more specific and more human than that. We have been tracking the cost of making art in public, at scale, over very long periods of time. The cost paid by the writers who got things wrong, the performers who had to decide what their own limits were, the communities who watched themselves depicted in ways that diminished them, and the creator who built something extraordinary and then had to watch it drift beyond his reach. Seth MacFarlane missed American Airlines Flight 11 on the morning of September 11, 2001, by approximately 10 minutes. His travel agent had given him the wrong departure time. He had been out the night before at his alma mater, the Rhode Island School of Design, giving a speech. He was hungover. He arrived at Logan International Airport 10 minutes too late to board. He went into the airport lounge, fell asleep, and woke up to a commotion. The first plane had already hit. He sat there and watched the second plane hit. Someone announced which flight had been struck. He turned to the person next to him and said, "My God, that was the flight I was supposed to be on." The show that had been canceled once and was about to be canceled again survived because of a hangover and a scheduling error. Family Guy exists because Seth MacFarlane was late for a plane. That story, that extraordinary piece of personal history, has always hovered at the edge of every conversation about what Family Guy means and what it cost and whether it was worth everything that happened. Because the show existing is contingent on someone's near death, on the improbable fact of someone's survival. The entire history we have been discussing tonight, every joke, every controversy, every firing and near firing and refusal and ban and regret, exists in the world because Seth MacFarlane overslept. He has spoken about the experience with unusual equanimity. He describes himself as not a fatalist. He says he missed other flights, that coincidences happen, that he does not feel as though he was saved by destiny or that his survival means he owes the world something specific. He experienced what he described as rattling for the first few weeks, and then he went back to work. The work he went back to eventually produced everything we have talked about tonight, the good and the bad, the brilliant early seasons and the declining later ones, the episodes that changed how people thought about comedy, and the episodes that should never have been made, the writers who grew and the writers who did not, the performer who stood in a recording booth and said no once in 20 years, the voice actor who spent 21 years voicing a black character and then looked up one summer and decided to hand the role back, the episodes that Fox pulled, and the episodes it refused to air, and the episodes it aired when McFarlane did not want it to. All of it, every piece of it. There is something worth naming directly before we close tonight. Something that runs underneath all of these individual stories like a current. The question that every controversial joke, every pulled episode, every fired writer, every forced recasting raises, in one form or another, is the question of what comedy is for, what purpose it serves, what it costs, and what it earns. Family Guy, at its best, was a show that used comedy to illuminate something true about American life that politer forms of entertainment would not touch. The early episodes were sharp because they were honest. They looked at the specific texture of working-class family life in America, at the gap between the way people present themselves and the way they actually are, at the small hypocrisies and large delusions that hold together the domestic arrangements of ordinary people, and they found the humor in all of that without flinching. Peter Griffin was funny because he was recognizable. Brian Griffin was funny because he was real. Even Stewie, with his world domination plans and his British accent, was funny because the gap between his ambitions and his reality was a version of something every person understands from their own experience. That kind of humor requires the creator to care about the truth they are illuminating. It requires a certain kind of respect for the audience, the belief that the people watching are capable of handling something complicated, something that does not resolve cleanly, something that contains more than one feeling at a time. The early Family Guy had that respect. You could feel it in the writing. The later Family Guy, the show that generated most of the controversies we have talked about tonight, lost that respect somewhere along the way. Not all at once, not in any single episode, but gradually, as the show accumulated seasons and the writing room changed, and the creator stepped back and the pressure to fill 22 minutes of television every week for year after year took its inevitable toll. The jokes got louder because the truth got quieter. The shock got louder because the insight had less to say. And the people who paid for that transition were not always the people who caused it. The writers who lost reputations, the actors who had to make uncomfortable decisions, the communities who watched themselves depicted carelessly, the executives who made financially motivated decisions that suppressed genuine creative work. The creator whose name remained on a show he no longer fully recognized. They all paid different parts of a bill that accumulated quietly over decades. There is a kind of accounting that happens in the history of cultural institutions, a long, slow reckoning with what was created and what was destroyed in the process of creating it. Family Guy has not yet fully completed that accounting. It is still running. It has been renewed through what will be its 30th year on television. New episodes are still being made by people who were not in the original room, voicing characters that have drifted far from who they started as. But the accounting is there, available to anyone who wants to do it. The stories we told tonight are part of it. The Japan earthquake tweet, the banned abortion episode, the Boston Marathon episode that got pulled from streaming, the voice actor who said no to a single line, the black character voiced by a white man for 21 years, the domestic violence episode that did not understand domestic violence, the crossover scene that had to be cut, the writers' strikes and the network decisions and the creator's slow, unhappy drift away from something he built and could no longer fully control. These are the stories that do not make it into the highlight reels. They do not go viral the way the funniest cutaway gags do. They do not get clipped and shared and watched by millions of people in 30-second increments. They live in the footnotes, in the Wikipedia controversy sections, in the interviews where someone says something they did not quite mean to say and the interviewer follows the thread. But they are there. And they are, in some ways, more revealing than the highlights. Because the way a creative institution handles its failures, the way it absorbs and responds to and eventually reckons with the specific moments when it got things badly wrong, tells you something essential about what that institution actually is. Family Guy, in its history of controversies and costs and consequences, reveals itself to be exactly what it has always appeared to be. A deeply human show, made by deeply human people, with all the creativity and vision and courage that implies, and with all the blindness and failure and unchecked momentum that human institutions, left without enough guidance or care, tend to accumulate. The show that started with 22 million viewers and a creator who had almost not lived to make it. The show that ended up with 700,000 viewers on a Wednesday night and a creator who was building his future somewhere else. The show that gave us some of the sharpest comedy of its era and some of the most embarrassing content that any major network program has ever produced. Family Guy cost people their privacy, their reputations, their professional standing, and their sense of what they were willing to participate in. Some of those people paid those costs because of choices they made. Some paid them because of choices other people made. Some paid them because of the terrible, random, heartbreaking coincidence of the world changing in ways that could not be anticipated. All of them are part of this story. And the story, remarkable and troubling and fascinating in equal measure, is not finished yet. If you made it all the way to the end of tonight's journey, thank you, genuinely. This was a long one, and the fact that you are still here means something. If this video resonated with you, if it gave you something to think about, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. It helps more than you know, and it tells us that there is an audience for this kind of careful, thoughtful, long-form storytelling. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on tonight's topic, and once again, let us know what time it is and where in the world you are watching from. Good night. Sleep well. We will see you in the next one. A final thought on jokes and what they cost. Before we close the file and let the quiet settle completely, there is one more thing worth saying. One more thought worth placing at the end of this long, careful walk through the history of Family Guy and the people whose lives it touched, in ways they did not necessarily anticipate. Jokes cost something, all of them, even the harmless ones. Even the ones that land perfectly and leave no wreckage and are remembered as exactly the kind of sharp, brilliant comedy that we celebrate when we describe the best of what Family Guy was. Every joke is a choice about what is worth making light of, and what is worth taking seriously, and who is invited to laugh, and who is invited to wince, and whether those two groups overlap in the way the writer imagined when they put the words down. Every joke is a small act of philosophy, a statement about what the person making it believes about the world and about the people in it. The jokes that got people fired, that got episodes pulled, that generated controversy and backlash and viral outrage and quiet professional consequence, those jokes were also choices. They were made by people who were sitting in a room and deciding what to put into the world. Some of those people made those choices carelessly. Some made them with more thought than the resulting controversy suggests. Some of them have spent years thinking about those choices and their consequences. Some have not. What all of them share is that they made the choice in the first place. They chose to reach for a particular kind of material, a particular kind of shock, a particular kind of comedy that operated at the edge of what audiences and institutions and affected communities were willing to accept. And in reaching for it, some of them found the line they could not cross. And some of them found it only when they had already crossed it, and the consequences were already arriving. That is what Family Guy has been, in the end. Not a horror story about creative failure, though it has elements of that. Not a cautionary tale about what happens to shows that run too long, though it has elements of that too. It is a very human story about what happens when people try to be funny about things that are not always funny. In a culture that changes faster than a production schedule that takes 10 months to make an episode, in a commercial environment that rewards reaching for the most loaded material without always rewarding the care required to handle it well. The show cost a lot of people, a lot of things. Some of them knew it at the time, some of them found out later, some of them are still finding out. That is what 25 years of jokes looks like when you stop to count the cost.